Thanks for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's Saturday webinar for Saturday, September 11th, 2021. This is the second in our American Presidency Fall mini-series of webinars, and our focus in this program was Powers in Concert and Conflict, Congress and the President. We were joined, as usual, by Dr. Chris Burkett of Ashland University, as well as Dr. David Alvis of Wofford College and Dr. Joseph Postel of Hillsdale College. Thanks again for listening.
Well, good morning and welcome to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett. I teach here at Ashland University, and I'm director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduate students here at Ashland University. This year in our webinar series, we are drawing inspiration for our topics from two core documents collections published by Ashbrook, both available at TAH.org. In the spring, we'll be discussing populists and progressives. This fall, our theme is the presidency in context, and we're drawing from our American Presidency core documents collection. So if you're joining us for the first time, the purpose of these webinars is to bring together some thoughtful scholars and have a conversation about the presidency this fall. And we encourage all of you joining us today to participate in that conversation by submitting questions in the Q&A function. And as always, we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. In the next week, you'll receive an email with a link by which you can request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. So today our topic is powers in conflict and concert. Actually, I read that backwards. Maybe it was a slip. Powers in concert and conflict, the executive and Congress. And I'm really, really happy to welcome two friends and two really, really thoughtful scholars on this topic. Dr. David Alvis of Wofford College and Dr. Joe Postel of Hillsdale College. Good morning, gentlemen, and thanks very much for joining us.
Morning. Thank you very much for having us, Chris.
It's always a pleasure. I've heard you guys speak on these topics many times, and I'll just tell you right up front, I am just always in awe of how much you guys know about this stuff. I just am a student at your feet when it comes to just learning about this stuff from you guys, and I'm not exaggerating there. So I'm really, really delighted that you could join us for this. I think this is going to be an interesting topic. So you guys know the way this works. We've done this many times. So I'm just going to sort of frame this very broadly, and then you guys take this in any direction you like. If you see questions in the Q&A box that you'd like to answer, please feel free to jump on those. And I'm hoping you'll really sort of get us at some point into these really interesting, this really interesting choice of documents with some really great examples of our topic today from Franklin Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt and Taft and others. So I'll just throw the big question out there to start with, and you do whatever you want with it or not. So I'll just ask this question: is what do you guys think? Is the Constitution intentionally framed to promote cooperation between the executive and Congress, the president and Congress, or is it designed in some ways, important ways, to create friction and to allow for this ambition counteracting ambition, as James Madison says in 51, to really come to the forefront? What do you guys think? Is it more cooperation or conflict?
Here, I'll start.
Please, David. Yeah, please.
No, that's a great question, because I think the way that we tend to think about the relationship among the branches is in terms of Madison's Federalist 51, where he talks about ambition counteracting ambition, checks and balances, right? The struggle, the sort of internecine warfare between the various branches as the key. And so you hear a lot of people talk about, right, that the Constitution was intentionally designed to sort of produce an inefficient government, and somehow inefficiency would favor liberty. And I don't think that gets it right. I mean, Federalist 51 is important for understanding how the branches maintain their powers, but there's a broader perspective, and that is that you want the branches to cooperate in the right way. And so I think it's important to see that the executive is constructed in a way that makes executing the law efficient. Now, you want the executive to be able to defend the capacity to execute the law from legislative interference. But at the same time, you want the executive to be able to operate efficiently as an executive. And so therefore, the executive is given powers that make that operation much more efficient. You have a unitary executive, a single executive. The executive has particular responsibilities. If you look at, for instance, the foreign affairs power, the executive is commander in chief. That makes sense because conducting a war requires energy, dispatch, right? A single person's better at that. On the other hand, Congress does have important war powers as well, right? Providing the appropriations for the Army, being able to regulate the uniform codes, right, for the day-to-day conduct of the Army and Navy. So the thing is that each of the branches is given a power to help facilitate its responsibilities, and therefore it needs to cooperate in those ways. But at the same time, they've got to be able to defend their area of power, and in that way, checks and balances are useful.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what David just said, although I think I would add to it that when we talk about Congress and the presidency, I actually think we need to be more precise about what we say. So Congress really isn't Congress. Congress is the House and the Senate. And Federalist 51, I think when you read it really carefully, you see that the House and the Senate are actually understood to be very different. So that, the great paragraph where the checks and balances in the Constitution are set up, there are a couple of really curious things the closer you read that paragraph that start to come out. The first is, that great line that in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates, which to my students is news, because they, in the 21st century, say there's no chance that that's true. The legislative authority is not predominating at all. The legislative authority is terribly weak, and the executive authority is what's become predominant. So the first thing that's interesting about the way the Constitution sets up this dynamic is that it's deliberately designed to weaken Congress and to strengthen the president, which from our point of view is curious, right? Because if anything, we think that the power imbalance is actually in the favor of the executive and not the legislature. But the other interesting thing, as they talk about the remedy for that, basically where they're trying to weaken the legislature and strengthen the executive, there's this line at the end of that paragraph where Madison writes that there should be some qualified connection between the weaker department and the weaker branch of the stronger department. And so the weaker department, of course, they mean the executive, the president. And then what is the weaker branch of the stronger department? Well, most of my students say, when I ask them this question, the House of Representatives. But of course, the House and the president are not tied together, but the Senate and the president are. So interestingly, I think the Constitution is designed to make the Senate a kind of adjunct to the executive, or at least in, say, matters of foreign affairs, kind of an advisory body to the executive. As many people know, I'm sure, Washington tries this out early on in his presidency, and it kind of fails miserably, and that's the end of that experiment. But I think the Constitution has a vision for how these two branches are going to interact, and even how the Senate will interact with the president. And interestingly, history hasn't really borne out the expectation of the Constitution, which is a really important question for us to think about as we're encountering this dynamic today.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things in both of your opening remarks here. So you remind me, Joe, for example, that if you read Federalist 47 and 48, before you get to 51, the focus is really on the fact that the legislative branch is the strongest. And of the two houses, I always got the impression that it is the House of Representatives that is, I mean, that's the impetuous vortex, if there is one, right? Because it's the House that has the support, the direct support of the people. It's the House that can, originate money bills. So it really has, more control over the power of the purse and these things. So so I never thought of it that way. The Senate is a kind of adjunct. Again, I don't know if that's the right term, but the Senate might be more inclined at times to lean in support of the president than in the House.
Yeah.
Really,
so when I draw the triangle of the checks and balances, I actually leave the judiciary out. So I draw House, Senate, and President, and then I put the Senate closer, like halfway between the House and the president. That's what I think that paragraph in Federalist 51 is saying, and most people kind of miss some of the subtleties there.
That's really interesting. So what do you guys think in light of how you both started this? So what do you think? I'd like to hear your thoughts on. Again, students today think, it's the president. The president runs everything, right? The president's the alpha and the omega, and Congress seems relatively weak. Is that really true? What do you guys think, or is that perception based on? I mean, is there something going on? Does Congress, say, for example, allow that perception to exist? Is there some benefit to Congress appearing at times to defer to the executive? What's really going on here? I'm not asking the question very well. I mean,
go ahead, David. I want to hear what you have to say before I
understand the question. Actually, I know it's wrong to differ from the Federalists, right? But I actually think Madison gets that point, the point about the power of Congress, the impetuous vortex of Congress. I actually think he gets that wrong in Federalist 51. And it betrays one of Madison's, I think, prejudices, and that is that the problem of power always comes down to the legislature. I mean, he had a good reason for thinking that, and that's what was going on in many of the state constitutions, especially during the Articles of Confederation period, is that you had this very strong, these very strong legislative branches. What he assumes is that the legislative branch is always the most powerful branch because it's always the most representative of the people. I think that's wrong, because I think that a lot of the state constitutions had artificial props that made the legislative branch predominant especially during the Articles of Confederation period. And that there were just in some ways many poorly, there were a sort of excessive numbers of checks on the governors and on the executives that gave those legislatures a certain predominance. I'm not positive that it's natural that the legislative branch is the predominant branch. And in some ways, during that period of time, governors people of the states looked to governors for leadership. And look to governors, especially in states, right, where you had stronger governors, like in Massachusetts. They looked to governors for leadership on the legislative agenda. And so today, when we talk about the predominance of the presidency, what we're talking about is how presidents seem to dominate the discussion about what should be the legislative priorities. In the Constitution, the president is given one of the duty of recommending to the legislature, recommending legislation in the State of the Union address. And I think the reason that is there is because the designers of the Constitution recognized that in a democracy, you need some sort of leadership, especially when it comes to things like the legislative agenda and what the nation's legislative priorities are. And I think that they anticipated that you needed a president that can provide that. You needed someone, right, that can focus the nation, because Congress simply cannot provide its own legislative priorities. It's not good at doing that. It doesn't have a leadership structure that allows for that. And Congress, right, is a collection of various competing constituencies, whereas the presidency represents the nation at large. So in some ways, I actually think that our current state, right, reflects, in fact, what the Constitution envisioned. You need national leadership in order to establish the legislative priorities, but it's up to Congress to figure out what the fine details of that looks like.
So I think David's answer here is the conventional treatment here, right? That the legislative branch doesn't really gather the affection of the people because there's so many of them. It's hard to see who's accountable, who's responsible for what's going on. The president is easier, or the governor at the state level. You can sort of concentrate your focus on one person who seems to be making the important decisions. And that's, in a popular form of government, that's how you most easily establish like an accountability from the people to the government. So I think I'm sympathetic to what David is saying, that this is just the analysis here in the Federalist, that the legislative branch would be the dominant branch, missed some of these really important factors. I'm not sure I fully agree though with it, because with what he's just said, because especially the part about, like, say, the legislature not having a leadership structure, not being able to control its own agenda. I think history has shown that Congress can, at times, put power in its leadership, the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader of the Senate, and that those leaders can set the agenda of Congress internally, so that Congress is not beholden to the presidency or not taking orders from the president. So that's clearly not what's going on today. But I think there are moments, if you look at American history, when Congress sort of insulated itself from the president's influence by establishing its own leadership structure. And so that's not where we are now, but I think that it wasn't inevitable that we went in the direction that we've gone.
I would say when speakers of the House attempt to articulate what national opinion is, right, and provide leadership, I would say that they tend to be disasters and do that. The Whig period is a good period of illustrating that, but the best illustration is Newt Gingrich, right?
Yeah.
The attempt to establish of a Speaker of the House to establish, right, what the legislative priorities are for Congress on the grounds that they can represent sort of national public opinion. I tend to think that ends up being disastrous, because at the end of the day, the Speaker of the House is one of 435 representatives. So in some ways, I'm not quite convinced, right, that Congress really, even though it has titles of leadership, really can ultimately provide any sort of leadership in that way.
Well, I mean, we're talking about the influence of the president on the legislature, right, in terms of leadership.
Right.
But on David's point, I think what you're getting at, help me understand this, is that the people, the nation as a whole, right? There's been a kind of, over time, almost natural, as you were putting it, tendency to look more and more to the president for some kind of leadership. I mean, leadership in terms of legislation is one thing, but as the sort of person who represents the nation, or I'm not doing this very well. I'm using a lot of the language from the progressive era, so forgive me. I'm sorry, but as sort of the embodiment of what the nation will do, and I mean that seems to have happened over time, and there may be. I think you were saying there's something natural about that. I mean, even in popular governments, you compare it to, say, for example, with the French Revolution, where the idea was we're going to have just pure legislative leadership of the nation, really, right? And look what happened there in just a matter of 3 years. You have almost inevitably the people start looking for that one leader, that unitary leader, to provide the direction for the nation. So I thought, David, you were saying that there's something almost natural in the sense that the people tend to look for leadership in one person, and that you most often find that in the office of the presidency, just because of the nature of that office.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the big picture, right? Particularly setting the legislative agenda, people are going to look for leadership, and they're going to look for somebody that can speak for those national priorities. And therefore, you have to have a national constituency in order to argue for those priorities. The problem for Congress, right, is that it's a collection of small constituencies, right, competing. And one of the best illustrations, I think, of that is, anytime Congress, right, takes the initiative of trying to control its own legislative agenda. I think the best example of Congress attempting to do that is the 1974 Congressional Budget Act, where Congress says, okay, look, we're not going to let presidents dictate to us what the budget should be, because the budget is critical for determining what should be our legislative priorities. And the Budget Act, I would say, almost its entire history has been a disaster. Congress turns out to be Congress, right, often ignores the budget process or can't come up with a budget in time, right? Often doesn't even, for a number of years, didn't even come up with appropriations on time. And it's precisely because Congress attempted to do something it's not really capable of doing. and that is providing its own leadership when it comes to the big things, right? Like setting the legislative priorities. And so often, the only person I know of who's ever used the Congressional Budget Act to any, beneficial use was Reagan in 1981 when he manipulated the Budget Act in order to be able to advance his own budget. So in some ways, right, I think the Congress rate is not good at that, and the presidency is better. And in some ways, I do actually think the Constitution anticipated that.
So Joe, on the flip side of that, can you think of examples when the reverse was true? When maybe it was any examples of when there was legislative leadership on this, and maybe what were the causes of this? Is it? I mean, there've been strong in presidents, and just look at the debate between Roosevelt and Taft, right? I mean, there's the Taft style of president, and then there's what did Roosevelt call him? The Taft Buchanan type president.
That's right.
then the Roosevelt Andrew Jackson types of presidents. So how does the type of the president affect the success maybe of legislative leadership?
Right. Yeah. Some presidents are like Abraham Lincoln. That happens to be me, Theodore Roosevelt. Others, like my successor, Taft, handpicked successor, of course,
right.
Turned out to be like Buchanan. And Taft has a nice quip about this in the document, about how, I just found out I'm the smartest kid in the class. I told myself
Right.
that I was, right. That's what Theodore Roosevelt is doing for himself there in his autobiography. I think, I'm not, Henry Clay, I think is, David Alvis is referring to Clay as Speaker of the House. Actually, we think of Clay as one of the great triumvirate of the senators during this sectional crisis. But actually, I think Clay's greatest legacy was in the House of Representatives, where he was the Speaker. And he really showed the possibilities of the speakership for the first time when he was in that position. And then, of course, in the late 19th century, there were these two great speakers, forgotten today, Thomas Brackett Reed and Joseph Cannon, who were extraordinarily powerful and basically set the legislative agenda. And Congress was, mostly in control of the government, and the Speaker of the House was the most powerful person in the government, say from the end of the Civil War to Theodore Roosevelt. And when you think about the presidents, who served in the 19th century, especially during that latter half, it doesn't appear as if it was natural and inevitable that you'd have dominant presidents when you think about that lineup, right? Benjamin Harrison, Chester Arthur, Garfield, Cleveland. I mean, Cleveland might be a partial exception here, but so I think there are periods where Congress really did not disastrously set an agenda, but actually did a pretty good job of setting the agenda. And there's an advantage here. This is a really, this is why I'm trying to stand up for legislative leadership and autonomy, because there's a different kind of majority that emerges through the legislature than emerges through the presidency. I mean, when you decide that the president is going to set the agenda for the country, then in one election every 4 years by a 51-49 margin, everything gets decided. And that makes presidential elections incredibly divisive, incredibly expensive. And it also makes presidents think of themselves as the most powerful people in the world, the leader of the free world, and all of that. And I think that's a lot of pressure to put on a political system, and it's a lot of pressure to put on one office. So Congress, I think, is built to take on more of that role. And because there are so many people in Congress, you can set up committees, you can specialize and gain expertise in policies, and you can bargain and you can compromise in the legislative branch. You can't do that in the executive branch. So I think part of the problem is our politics have become so toxic and so divisive, and presidential elections have become so contested and contentious, in part because we've forgotten how to rule ourselves through our legislative branch.
Yeah, I want to comment on that too. I mean, this is an important point just brought up too. Is that, in the degree to which the executive has become all important in elections, right, almost makes you forget, right, that the legislature does have a role. And before I go too far in suggesting that, the entirety of government just comes down to the executive branch, I do want to illustrate that it is important that the executive work closely with the legislature, and that both, right, provide an important contribution to the overall success of policy, that if they don't work together, right, can be really disastrous, particularly in the way that Joe's bringing up, and that is that, if you have a situation like you have now, where all policy making is being done through executive order, I mean, you have an incredibly unstable situation. And that Taft versus Roosevelt, those two pieces is a great illustration of this. So I just want to mention one thing about Roosevelt. Roosevelt's making this argument for the president as the steward of the people, and that he used executive power in any way necessary in order to be able to fulfill, right, that responsibility as steward of the people. I just want to point out in that piece how far he goes to exaggerate what he's doing. So for instance, right, he talks about, right, that Congress had these statutes on coal lands and water construction projects, and that essentially, right, had he followed the statutory law, we would have been selling coal lands for well below what they were worth, and we would have been engaged in some disastrous projects with water conservation projects. The one thing that Roosevelt says, I essentially use my executive power to save us from that situation. Therefore, I'm a steward of the people. The one thing that he never mentions is that the statutes in both cases gave the executive the discretion that Roosevelt used. In other words, he was authorized by Congress to do exactly what he does, but he just never mentions that. That's an important thing, right? He was actually working within the framework of the statutory law. That's what allowed him to be able to wield that kind of executive power. So he's setting up a situation, right, where it's this branch versus that branch, when in fact, right, the two were working together in a way that made perfect sense. Congress had given the president some discretionary authority to alter the law when the circumstances necessitated, because they anticipated the limitations of statutory law when it came to dealing with particular situations. That law was actually a pretty good example of how Congress and the president can work together. And so Roosevelt entirely misinterprets, right, what he himself was doing. Taft, on the other hand, right, makes, I think, a very strong case why you need to work with the legislature, right, in order to be able to achieve really lasting long-term goals. Right? Mm-hmm. It's just that Taft doesn't really imagine that there's any sort of room for Congress to give the executive discretionary authority when it comes to something like enforcing antitrust laws, which you need that. And so in some ways, both of them have misinterpreted, I think, Roosevelt too liberally, right, Taft too conservatively, because I don't think that either understands that it's not a predominance of one branch over the other. Rather, it's utilizing the best in one branch in order to complement, right, the goals of the other branch. Congress is good at legislating, but only in broad strokes. You need an executive that can make decisions, right, based on the contingency of the circumstances.
Can I make a couple points? Because this issue of Roosevelt's revisionist history here, I think, is really fascinating. And there are a couple of historical sort of intricacies that I think are really important for understanding this document. So the first is, gets to the question of antitrust that David brought up towards the end of what he just said. This is one of the great mysteries or, paradoxes of how we teach history is we teach Theodore Roosevelt as the great trust buster. And of course, he only did it once. And Taft as somehow like the person who betrayed Roosevelt's legacy, and yet Taft was the great trust buster. Why? Because he used the Sherman Antitrust Act, which required him to go to court rather than just unilaterally through executive action start busting up and regulating the trusts. And of course, this is what causes Roosevelt to come back in 1912 and say, hey, I don't really like Taft as president. I need to take the presidency back from him. And so when Roosevelt's writing about his presidency, he's writing about a time when he didn't really have an enormous amount of executive power, just like David was saying, right? He's working within statutes, not outside of them. And of course, he's having to work with Congress during his presidency. And the Speaker of the House at the time that he has to work with is Joseph Cannon. And Cannon is a powerful member in the House of Representatives. So Roosevelt can't bully the House into following his will because Cannon is there to bargain with, but also he has to bargain with Cannon. He can't just run roughshod over the Congress during his presidency. He wanted to come back in 1912 because it would have been a different situation then. So the other great, sort of phrase that's attributed to Roosevelt is the bully pulpit. And yet he was actually constrained by Congress for the most part during his presidency. So it's an interesting spin that he's putting on his presidency and some of the actions that he took here in this document.
He does give some examples after he makes that claim of being a steward of the people and characterizing himself as kind of a I don't know, I was going to say bad boy, but he's a kind of a renegade. But as you guys both point out nicely, the examples he gives are really mild compared to the sorts of things presidents start doing, especially after FDR. So he sort of pushes back on some degree of congressional oversight that he thinks will be unnecessary. He pushes back on questions of appointment and removal, but these are relatively mild things, as you say, I think, compared to. But there are a number of this has been really fascinating. There are a number of really great questions coming in. And Heath has asked a couple here. So I want to start with, I don't know can you guys see the questions? Okay. So Heath asked, are we living in the age of Brutus? So I'm trying to make sense of what he means by this. We still have Publius' system of checks and balances, but we also have allowed a corporate interest agenda to remove ourselves from having a real sense of control over the people we elect to these positions. So he talks about career politicians who just can't lose an election no matter what. How has the rise of, maybe I'm not even phrasing this correctly, the rise of corporate interests, if that's what Heath means by this, affected the sort of balance of power, if you want to put it that way, or the relationship between Congress and the president. And I want to connect this. I know this is a really convoluted question. I want to connect this to his other point, 2 questions down, where he asks about tips for teaching the importance of protecting the minority as well as the will of the majority. So maybe I'll rephrase the question along those lines. Which arrangement is better for protecting the rights and interests of the American people, including the minority? A dominant presidency or a dominant Congress?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is easy. Congress, right?
Okay.
Again, this is a point I was making maybe a few minutes ago, that the presidency, it's all or nothing by a pure plurality, really. If your person wins the presidency by finishing first in the Electoral College, they get all the power. And, in a presidential system, they get to set the agenda for the whole thing, which really is a sort of pure majoritarian system. Whereas Congress is interesting. You have to win multiple majorities. So maybe the majority that controls the House isn't the same majority that controls the Senate. You have to get not really a majority of the states to win the Senate, because, you could gain the majority some other way, but basically you need to win different constituencies and different majorities to win control of both houses of Congress. And then, of course, with rules like a filibuster in the Senate, it protects the minority from a majority that would infringe upon its rights and its interests. But then there's also a deeper point here. The president represents the nation. This is the virtue of the presidency that David was just talking about, but that's also the vice. Because if you're talking about wanting to protect sort of local interests, the people who will do that are the John Dingles of the world, who protect the Detroit automakers for 50 years. John Dingell, the representative from Detroit, who succeeded his father in that seat. So his father holds the seat from Detroit, for decades, and basically uses the power to protect auto manufacturers. Then John Dingell gets it. He has it for like 59 years. I think that's still maybe the record of anybody who's held an office in the House. And now his wife has it after he died. It's like the closest thing we have in America to a feudal a feudal system. The Dingles just own that district. but they do it because they protect a local interest. And the president can't do that for the very reasons that we've been talking about. The presidency is a national constituency. So if you want to protect local interests, if you want to protect minorities and require that bargaining and that compromise that are going to protect those interests, then Congress is the place you have to look.
Okay. David, any thoughts on that?
I agree with Joe that the answer is easy and clear. I just disagree over what the answer is. If you're trying to protect policy, right, from getting captured, right, by corporate special interests, right, the answer is the presidency, not Congress. I mean, my view is that lobbyists know, right, it's far easier to work with members of Congress and to influence members of Congress than it is to influence the presidency. Precisely because, right, an office that has to respond to a national constituency is going to be much less inclined, right, to side, right, with a particular part, unless that group has an overwhelming influence and is large, and if it is, then it's probably, right, aligns with some large national majority. I think I tend to think that the presidency, right, is a better check on that. And actually in the Constitutional Convention debates, there was one figure that actually did make this argument that the executive would actually be in some ways a check, right, against special interests or potentially an aristocracy in Congress, and that is Gouverneur Morris, right, makes the argument that you want a president elected by a national constituency by a popular vote, precisely because the president can serve as a guardian of the people against the interests, right, against the special interests that would naturally tend to predominate within the legislative branch.
Okay, so that's fantastic. And David's answer is a really important one, right? He's basically saying, if you don't want special interests to take over the political system, the president is the person to turn to, because the president can't be captured. I mean, John Dingell's the perfect example, of course. You know, I'm talking about him protecting local interests, but of course, local interests are special interests. He basically protected the auto manufacturers from foreign competition for decades. But here's the interesting change that's happened in the last 40 years in the economy that I think throws a lot of this up in the air, right? The interests today aren't GM and Ford. The interests today are Amazon and Google and Apple. They have no local base. They don't exist in a district anymore. And so the interesting thing now is, I mean, Amazon will just move and extract, resources from wherever it goes. So you don't have the same kinds of interests. And the corporate interests today, it's a little different how they work with Congress versus the president. So that's something I think we haven't really fully understood, or we don't really fully understand yet.
That's a really great point. That's a subtle point. Yeah, you're right. Wow, I hadn't thought about that. Well, this is great stuff. So, David, did you want to jump in? I didn't want to.
Well, I mean, also too. it is complicated by the fact that, right, these companies, right, have such a large share of the market. And there is a major concern right now, too, about the share of the market that they have and the influence that has on our political system. I mean, you also, too, it goes even farther than that, right? You have the multinational corporations that influence, right, at least, unilateral executive agreements or unilateral treaty making powers. So, I agree, it becomes more complicated and more difficult to fend those off. Even for a national executive. I mean, those companies would have profound influences over local governments, because, but whether or not a national executive can fend them off, I think that's a very difficult question for the future.
Yeah, I mean, the local governments bend over backwards to cater to them. So, there are all kinds of instances where this happens.
Yeah, if I had a house in the Amazon Triangle, I'd be doing everything I could, right, to advance the interests of Amazon in my local area.
Yep.
Well, this is, I think, maybe pointing us to a larger question Joe actually asked. So I want to maybe shift in that direction. But before we do, something you mentioned earlier about, one of you brought up canon, and Joe asked if hasn't there been a change in House rules that has kept speakers from exerting the kind of power that canon had? Is that something to that?
Yeah,
Joe, I
so
think you've written on this, right?
yeah, profound changes in the way that the House works that have basically weakened the Speaker of the House these days. So, if you looked at, say, the last two Republican speakers, John Boehner and Paul Ryan, it's pretty clear they were no czar. That's the word that was used to describe Joe Cannon. He was a czar of Congress. So a lot of this has to do with how committees are chosen in the House of Representatives. During the late 19th century, the speaker got to choose every member of every committee, got to pick the committee chairs, and of course, then the committees did the bidding of the speaker. Whereas today, the committees are chosen by a steering committee. The speaker doesn't have total control over that committee, although it's really hard to even figure out how that steering committee makes committee assignments. The media don't report on the intricacies of this. A lot of this does happen behind closed doors. And then I guess the other major change is this thing called the Rules Committee, which is how legislation gets tracked to the floor of the House of Representatives. Joseph Cannon controlled that Rules Committee, and he got to decide which bills went to the floor. Today, the speaker has some control over the Rules Committee, but there are ways to weaken the speaker's influence. So, ultimately, the deepest problem here is that the speaker itself is much more susceptible to minorities within the party who will vacate the chair if the speaker ever steps out of line. So this is what the Freedom Caucus was going to do to Boehner. They were basically going to vote to vacate the speakership, to kick him out. And so parties are just much less cohesive today. This is, of course, news to everybody, because if you look at the voting records, the Republicans always vote together and the Democrats always vote together. So these parties must just be totally organized and marching in lockstep. But it's actually not the case. They all vote, with each other against the other party. But then when you try to get them to vote positively for anything, the coalition breaks apart very quickly. So I think the speakers are much weaker, in part because of the structure and the rules of the House, but even more fundamentally because parties themselves don't have a coherent kind of identity the way that they used to.
Yeah, that's really interesting because we haven't really brought up parties, directly anyway. So how have parties, I wanted to ask an initial question, but I want to work parties in here too. So I was going to ask, have presidents, again, recent presidents, been able to somehow, I don't want to say take advantage, but have they gained some leverage in terms of influence as a result of the changes of rules, House rules? But I just want to kind of throw in there, how do parties affect the influence of the president, or the relationship between president and Congress? Is something we haven't really talked explicitly about.
Yeah.
And I know both of you have written on this as well.
Go ahead, David.
Well, I'll say something provisionally because I know Joe is writing a book on this. Parties. Part of the logic of parties was that it was a way, right, that localities could work through an institution to check, right, the presidency, and also to check the presidency, and it had the benefit of giving Congress the ability to resist certain ambitions and certain initiatives of the executive. So it did serve as a sort of popular check, right, on the potential abuse of power by the presidency. And now the weakening of that party, right, the fact that the parties are fairly hollow now, the only thing that kind of sort of unifies them tends to be a sort of ideological markers, right, rather than, substantive or useful tools. Call them corruption or whatever you like, but so that means, right, that's a vacuum, right, in which the presidency has been able to step in and be much more powerful. I actually, even as a proponent of executive power, I do think that is a problem, because it does prevent, right, that kind of ongoing participation in politics that may make citizens ultimately indifferent, right, to the fate of particular policies.
Yeah, so I think when you look at Federalist 51, the essay doesn't mention parties until the end, But Federalist 51 is basically an essay that presumes parties will not exist. So the whole point of the separation of powers is that the departments will check and balance each other. But of course, if the president and the Congress are of the same party, they're actually going to collaborate with each other rather than checking and balancing each other. So parties on the one hand are this great threat to the separation of powers. If Congress, if it's a Democratic Congress and there's a Democratic president, Congress will actually give its power over to the president. Or if there's a Republican Congress and a Republican president, the same thing will happen. And so it's interesting, the framework seems to say parties shouldn't exist. And nevertheless, the same people who wrote the Constitution ended up creating the first two parties and engaging in all this really nasty partisan warfare against each other. Stuff that the way that they fought politically, the partisan conflict of the 1790s puts us to shame. The things that they wrote and said about each other are much more over the line than what we say to each other in politics today. This is we think it's bad now. Go read what happened in the 1790s. It was really nasty. That's why you had the Alien and Sedition Acts and all of that. So parties were really necessary to make the system work. And for a long time, parties disciplined, just as David was saying, disciplined the presidency. So the president was chosen by the party at these nominating conventions where the parties would actually choose who the presidential candidates were, and therefore the presidents were tied to their parties and were taking cues from the party. Today, it's actually quite different. The reverse has happened. Instead of parties over the president is now over the parties. So once the president gets the nomination and wins the election, the party now falls in line behind the president. And so I think that's because parties have become so weak that the only thing that can organize them is the presidency. And so I think the presidency has been dramatically strengthened by the weakness of these parties. And interestingly, this is something I missed in the Youngstown case, which was one of the documents we chose for this webinar. At the very end, Jackson's concurrence talks about how political parties strengthen the presidency. And so he even quotes Woodrow Wilson on this point. So it's a point that Jackson understands to be critical in the context of the Truman seizure of the steel mills.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to ask, when did that shift in president's relationship to the parties, whether he's beholden to the party or the leader of the party, when would you say that actually starts to occur? I've always thought it was around Woodrow Wilson. But Wilson. Is it more? You say Wilson, David?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but the key figure there was actually Theodore Roosevelt. So the 1912 election is where Roosevelt says, well, I'm not going to try to get he does try to get the nomination through his party, and the party denies him the nomination. And instead of agreeing with the decision made by the party and trying to support the party, Roosevelt says, no, I'm just going to form my own party. And it's the first time, this is a perfect illustration of the point, we call it the Bull Moose Party. And technically it was called the Progressive Party. But here is a party that is named after the candidate. It's organized entirely for the sake of a candidate. And of course, the Progressive Party goes nowhere after Roosevelt is out of the picture, because it's not a party. It's a campaign organization for one person.
I mean, you're also right, Chris. I mean, in some ways, Wilson was kind of the intellectual architect of that idea. So he argues, right, in his book, Constitutional Government, for making the president head of the party for precisely this reason. Ironically, though, Wilson never really seems to attempt to achieve it in practice. Yeah. It's actually Roosevelt that does it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So all sorts of other great questions. Sorry, I accidentally muted myself. But before we move on, can we indulge Mary, who asks, I'd love to be able to give examples to our students of times when the parties, I would say, allowed Congress maybe to serve as a check on the president. Can you give an example or two of how the existence of parties gave Congress some checking power over something the president wanted to do?
Yeah, I think the great example is Andrew Jackson. Now, we don't think of Jackson as a restrained president. Actually, we think of him as kind of the one really powerful president prior to the Civil War. There's this really great letter from Martin Van Buren, who's the hero of he's the great architect of the two-party system. When I teach a course on political parties, the two heroes of the class are Martin Van Buren and William Howard Taft, which are very unlikely heroes from the student's point of view when they walk in for the semester. They don't think they're going to hear how great Martin Van Buren is. He writes this letter to Thomas Ritchie in 1827, and I'm certain that it's on the Teaching American History website. In fact, it's in the political party's core documents reader. And he writes a letter saying, we need to set up a national nominating convention so that Andrew Jackson is chosen by the party. And if we do that, then Jackson can't say he won a personal victory, and therefore he gets to do whatever he wants. We get to say to him, you got the office because we gave it to you. And so now you have to start listening to us. And, Jackson wasn't perfectly restrained by Congress during his presidency. I think a lot of people would point to a lot of evidence that he ran over Congress in many ways. But I actually think it would have been much worse if it wasn't for people like Martin Van Buren trying to build a structure around Jackson to make it seem like he was part of a larger, sort of coalition. I think that's the first example that comes to mind. And that letter is so good that I think it would be a useful teaching tool for students.
Yeah, that's a great example.
I mean, another good example would be, Theodore Roosevelt is your classic example of somebody who thought you could just ignore the party leadership and use executive power on the grounds, right, that the president is the steward of the people. And I mean, as much as we tend to idealize his presidency as this example of robust presidential leadership over congressional obstruction, the fact of the matter is that really wasn't true. Really, by the end of his presidency in 1907, 1908, I mean, Congress was actually aggressively fighting back.
Yeah.
And that's probably the reason why he didn't go for a second term. He claimed it, right, that because it would be a third term. There was no reason for that argument. It was because he was getting really hemmed in by Congress. So, he was using executive orders in order to circumvent congressional legislation at a huge rate, particularly the reserving lands as national parks. And so what Congress finally did was they basically withdrew all the discretionary power, right, in various committees: Intercoastal Waterways Act, Country Life Commission, the National Antiquities and Monuments Act. He had been using all of these discretionary powers, right, in those statutes in order to carry out these very broad executive actions. So Congress just rescinded those. And at that point, there wasn't much he could do. I mean, it is an example, right, where the party in Congress, right, really said, okay, we're gonna stand up to the president.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example. That's better than Jackson because, first of all, it's Roosevelt's own party that's doing this to him, and it's canon, right? He's just one of my two great examples of a great House leader. And then I suppose the other thing, just to make sure we're talking about the Senate too, there's this group of senators, they're called the Senate Four, and you can find information about them when you sort of do some research. There were kind of four really powerful committee chairs in the Senate who were doing the same thing in the Senate as Cannon was doing in the House. If it's all right, I'll add one more example just because it came to mind as David was talking, and that's ironically FDR. So this is the interesting thing with Jackson, Roosevelt, and FDR. It's three presidents we think who did run roughshod over Congress, but who actually in many ways were hemmed in. So the Democratic Party during FDR's presidency was both very conservative, at least one of the wings of the Democratic Party, the Southern wing was very conservative, and also very powerful and very much opposed to FDR. So after the first 100 days, where Congress basically let FDR have whatever legislation he asked for, Congress really started putting the brakes on the New Deal. And that's why FDR has to engage in what's called the Purge campaign of 1938, where he actually goes out and tries to primary his own people. He actually intervenes in primary elections to get Democrats out of office so that he can have more influence in Congress. So the Democrats during the New Deal were even resisting FDR, sort of trying to put the brakes on the New Deal. So this does happen quite a bit, in the earlier parts of American history.
those are great examples. So I hope that helps. I'm sure that'll help Mary with her teaching. So just wanted to note, by the way, Jeffrey dropped a question about foreign policy powers. I'm going to hold off on that because we're going to do, that's actually going to be the theme of our next webinar, unless you guys really want to run with that. I am sort of chomping at the bit at Joe's question about the rise of the administrative state and how this affects, it throws the whole thing up, right, in a way, or rearranges this whole relationship. So could you, again, I know you both have thought a lot about this, and I've heard you both speak about the effect of the creation of a kind of real, well, I don't know if it's the creation, but the expansion of an administrative apparatus that seems to be under the authority of the president, but at the same time is, you know, Congress always wants to claim that the administrative apparatus is its creation and it has oversight. So how is the rise of 20th century administration, maybe modern administration, affected the relationship between Congress and the presidency? I know this is a huge topic and we only have like 15 minutes left. But
yeah, there's no way I'm going after Joe on this, right? So I want to point out to everyone, right? Joe Postel has a phenomenal book, right, on the administrative state, on bureaucracy, that I've read twice. You have to read it twice.
Thank you, Dave.
I'm going in for a third time, right, soon. There's a lot there. So I'll give a provisional answer, and then I'm really looking forward to Joe's comments on this. So, all right, the way I actually see it in terms of just a broad statement about the administrative state today is, on the one, from one perspective about it that I actually don't find the modern administrative state controversial, and there's another aspect of it where I do. And both of them have to do with Congress's reason for delegating broad powers to the administrative state. What I don't think is particularly controversial is the size of the administrative state in one aspect. And that is, in some ways, the administrative state reflects the complexities of modern governing. I mean, you've got, you know, a much more complicated national economy today, many more complicated aspects of both society, economics, and politics today that explain, right, why the growth of the administrative state. And Congress, I think, delegates. I don't have a problem with Congress delegating through broad legislation power to the administrative state to make regulatory rules where you need expertise to make judgments in particular cases based on their contingency. So there, I don't see it. I just see it as a sort of natural growth of modern government. On the other hand, there's another reason that Congress delegates its power broadly to an administrative state, and that is because a lot of the issues are simply too controversial for Congress. And therefore, they want to delegate to some expert administrator, supposedly expert administrator, the ability to make rules because Congress doesn't want to make those rules. And I do regard that as a problem. That's in some ways a neglect of legislative responsibility. And I think that's where you see today, I think most of the problems, especially democratically with the administrative state, is where Congress simply doesn't want to legislate because it doesn't want to take the heat for legislation. And so therefore they kick the issue over to the administrative state.
Yeah, I would agree with everything David just said. You know, there is room, I think, in the Constitution for Congress to give discretion and give authority to the executive branch on matters that, you know, really are executive in nature. The problem, of course, is that Congress can also delegate responsibility and accountability over to the administrative state, which is what it likes to do. So that's I think the problem when we talk about what the administrative state presents in terms of disrupting this. I think the interesting thing, this goes back to a question that Chris asked earlier, you know, when did Congress become so weak vis-a-vis the presidency? I actually think the answer to that question is something like the last 30 to 40 years. And up until, say, 1970, the late 1970s, I think Congress was the most dominant branch of the political system for just about all of American history, with the exception maybe of the New Deal, during certain parts of the New Deal. Congress, interestingly, has asserted itself throughout American history. And even when the administrative state was constructed, Congress still managed to reorganize itself to control it. So this is the great sort of myth of the administrative state, is that it's just a transfer of power over to the presidency. What Congress did through most of the 20th century, up until the late 70s, I would say, is it gave a bunch of authority over to an administrative agency and then set up a committee that would be filled with people who would, on behalf of their local interests, conduct oversight and especially conduct the flow of money to the agency on behalf of their constituents. So every office in Congress has, every member's office in Congress has a bunch of staff whose job it basically is to conduct casework. And what casework is getting constituents out of the bureaucratic mess that you, the member of Congress, have placed them in. So, if they need some help from the VA, the Social Security Administration, they need a passport from the State Department, if their local interest needs some sort of exemption from a business regulation. Well, if you're on the committee that appropriates money over to the agency, you should call your member, calling the member of Congress is going to help you out if that member is on that committee, much more than calling the bureaucracy and trying to ask for some favor. And so what Congress realized very quickly was that it could, if it reorganized itself into these committees, it actually would control the administrative state. The president up here at the top can't control the vast expanse of the administrative state. It's a management problem. And every president, Richard Nixon was the first to encounter this, Ronald Reagan encounters it later. You don't even know what the administrative state is doing if you're sitting in the White House. Whereas these members of Congress who've been there for decades, they don't have term limits like the president does. And they've got all these staff who can keep track of what the agencies are doing. They'll actually be the ones running the show. So that worked when Congress was organized into committees and had members who made careers in Congress. The downside to that system was, even though it kept power in Congress, it didn't keep power in Congress as a whole. It kept power in Congress as at the committee level or even at the individual level. And of course, that was just the capture of these administrative agencies by organized interests. So Congress was in charge of the administrative state, I say, up until 40 years ago. But the downside to that was Congress just directed all of the activities of the administrative state towards the concentrated interests, the special interests that they were beholden to. Obviously, since then, the president has regained kind of the upper hand because Congress basically decided to restructure itself to get rid of all of those advantages that it had.
So why would Congress do that, by the way?
Yeah.
What was the reason? Do you know what was? I don't, unless we need to buy the book to find out.
This is the next book, actually. It's about
that's what I meant. The next book.
Yeah. No, I think the short and simple answer is partisanship happened. So in part, it was the Democratic Party during the middle of the 1970s kind of gutted its committee structure in Congress. And they started to move power up to the speaker. And that's where you got Tip O'Neill and then Jim Wright, very powerful speakers of the House. But then the key figure a few years later is Newt Gingrich, who basically thinks of himself as running the show in Congress, and the committees start to lose their influence to today where, members of committees have a lot less influence than they would have 50 or 60 years ago.
That's fascinating. Again, maybe it's just me, but it seems like there's a perception that the president runs, he's in charge of the administrative apparatus, the administrative state, but that's not necessarily so. It's this weird interplay of influence of the president and Congress.
And the courts, which, is too complicated to add into this, but yes, the courts are heavily involved in all this as well.
Yeah. So I'm going to shift to maybe ask David a question. David, do you have, which presidents would you say have been the best at, how do I want to word this, controlling or having influence over administration? Have some presidents been better at this than others?
Yeah, so, some have been better. It depends on exactly how they concentrate their authority in this way. when for the Reagan administration, this was going to be their primary focus, was gaining control back over the administrative state. And I think one of the most effective things they got, right, was the Paper Reduction Act, right, which allowed Reagan's OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, to be able to have oversight over all the agencies, overall sort of policy making within the administrative state, and subject it to review. So, they tend to be, insofar as that's a major focus of the executive branch, they tend to be very effective. They can't. Some presidents have been very effective, depending on how they structure the internal organization within the administrative state. Another president that focused a lot on this was Clinton, through the Reinventing Government program, RIGO, and it was kind of some mixed successes, because everything there was kind of put on a utilitarian sort of economic basis. But Clinton did actually have a number of successes in terms of gaining control over the administrative state. But the big obstacle for presidents is still the independent regulatory agencies. There you have officers directing those agencies, either as a commission or a single director, and the president cannot influence that person because the president doesn't have any control. And there's a lot of those agencies. So that's the current issue being really debated in the last few years on the court through a number of cases, is whether or not that actually fits the constitutional structure of government that we have.
Can I just quickly second the Clinton reference? Because I think on tobacco regulation, Clinton he used this very interesting strategy where he would get out in front of the FDA, and he would announce basically in like a high profile press conference that the FDA was going to do X. And it turns out that the FDA hadn't really decided yet that it was going to do that. But once the president has said, this is what the agency is doing, they felt a lot of pressure to actually do it. And there are a variety of, techniques that Clinton would use. Clinton was a master politician, just fantastic at sort of using the presidency and using the rhetorical opportunities it offered. And there was a law professor who'd worked in the Clinton administration. She was the dean of the Harvard Law School at the time. She wrote an article called Presidential Administration, where she sort of chronicled how President Clinton had used the presidency to run the administration. And then she eventually became Justice of the Supreme Court. Elena Kagan was the person who wrote that article. So that person is now on the Supreme Court. And as David just mentioned, the court is now starting to think through a lot of these questions about whether the president can run the administrative state through, especially the independent regulatory commissions.
Yeah, she's interesting too, because on the one hand, right, that Peace presidential administration seemed to be very sympathetic to Clinton's unitary leadership over the executive branch, but she's also too been the biggest dissenter in these cases, right, involving getting rid of these independent regulatory agencies.
Right.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So just to take a step back, this is really interesting, to just take a step back so I can kind of, again, get my head around this. Would you say that the growth and changes in administration in the last half of the 20th century has it brought the Congress and the president together in more ways in which they can cooperate, or has it been more of a source of conflict between them? Just to tie it into the larger theme of our webinar today. Or is it both?
More conflict, I think I would say. But also the administrative state, it's really hard to figure out who's running anything in the administrative state, I think, because again, the courts are sometimes heavily involved in this as well. And so in a way, it's like this hydra, and it's hard to get your head around it because the thing is so big and it's so diverse in how it operates that sometimes the president can make a decision without Congress. Sometimes Congress can, without the president, run parts of the administrative state. But on the whole, it's maybe just enabled them to not work together, because you can now make policy without even going through the process of passing a law. And that's the bottom line here, is that The lawmaking process requires Congress and the president to at least somewhat agree on what is done. And the administrative process basically can be done by circumventing the lawmaking process, which means there's no need for that collaboration to occur.
Yeah, I think it's also too, it's distracted Congress from its primary responsibility of legislating. I mean, the amount of time wasted in oversight hearings is a huge distraction, but Congress prefers that because it's a way of bullying the administration to get the kind of policy making that you want, rather than taking the harder task, which is to legislate what the policy ought to be. And so I think in some ways, right, at the end of the day, it's been a raw deal for Congress, I think, delegating that much authority.
Well, that, again, thank you both. That's very thoughtful treatment in 10 minutes of a really big topic. So, and we're down to our last few minutes here. So I'm going to go to a question from Kathy, and it kind of brings us, I think, in a way back to where we started with this conversation. Kathy asks about the ability to sway public opinion as a source of power. Her question is, isn't swaying public opinion a source of power for the president that can greatly influence Congress? What do you think of that question? Does it work both ways, though?
Oh, that's interesting. I want to hear Joe's answer. I think no. I mean, I think if you have a confrontation between the president and Congress, right, 9 times out of 10, the president's going to win. Right? That almost is always the case on disputes over the budget. On the big political issues, I always think in some ways the president's going to win because the president really is able to utilize, right, that national constituency in a way that Congress cannot. So, the showdown between Clinton and Gingrich was I think a classic illustration of that. At the end of the day, the Speaker of the House cannot speak for the nation, and nor can any member of Congress. So at the end of the day, I always think Congress is at a disadvantage there. And the question is whether or not that's a good thing on certain issues, like setting the legislative agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the president needs something from Congress, the Congress is at an advantage. And if Congress wants to do something, the president is at an advantage because the president can veto and therefore can require a supermajority in Congress. So it's interesting. That's a key distinction, right? If Congress wants to get something done, it needs the president's permission, and that puts the president in charge. But if the president wants a piece of legislation from Congress, like H.R. 1, this pretty significant priority of the Democrats have control of Congress right now, and it's not happening. Why? Because there are individuals in Congress, Joe Manchin being an obvious example, who can withhold their votes. But I think the deeper answer here goes back to the seismic shift that has happened in American politics over the last 40 years. I think when the president spoke 40 years ago, it could sway public opinion because the office had respect of the American people. The office wasn't as divisive as it's become. And so that even somebody like Reagan, who was clearly a partisan and a conservative, could still capture the attention of the American people by speaking. But today, whether it's Trump or Biden, I don't think this is either or. I think half of the country will be angry at what the president has to say and will be unpersuaded and perhaps even would actually be more entrenched against the policy if the president endorsed it. There's a great example of this. Trump came out and spoke on behalf of some Republican Party priorities the first 2 years of his term when Republicans controlled the House and the Senate. And the Republican leaders went to Trump and said, you need to stop endorsing the policies that we're trying to pass.
Wow.
Because the more that you speak, the less we can get done. So the president there actually, his words had the opposite effect. They actually turned people against the policy in Congress. And so eventually he actually stopped endorsing these policies because the bully pulpit was actually working in reverse there. So that wouldn't have happened 40 or 50 years ago. Something clearly has changed dramatically in the way politics works in this country.
Well, those are, again, great answers. I think that's a great question to end on. I would love to keep this conversation going, but we're at the end of our time. But I really appreciate your thoughts from both of you on this. And as always, I've learned a great deal. And to those of you joining us, read anything that these two scholars have written on these topics, on Congress, the presidency, parties, administration. They are both top-notch scholars and thinkers on these things, and I guarantee you'll learn a lot from both of them. So very happy to have had both of you here today to talk about this topic.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks. I enjoyed it. It was great.
Yeah, that was fun. Very, very thoughtful. So, and again, thanks to everybody who joined us, and thanks for some great questions. Just another quick reminder about the email that you'll get with your link for a certificate of participation. If you've enjoyed our webinar today, look into the other resources that Ashbrook provides on the TAH.org website. We have other webinars on Wednesday evenings each month called Documents in Detail. Our Rediscovering America in-person seminars are back, so keep checking for dates and topics for those. And if you don't mind, please help us spread the word about these webinars by sharing the archive link on social media. Share it with your colleagues and your friends, please. So our next Saturday webinar will be on October 2nd, and we'll be discussing presidential war powers in foreign policy. And I'll be joined by Dr. Sarah Burns of Rochester Institute of Technology and Dr. Stephen Knott of the U.S. Naval War College. Hope to see you all then. And until then, take care. Thanks for joining.
You can learn more about our documents, resources, and programs for teachers of American history, government, and civics at TAH.org. And if you want information about upcoming webinars and other archived webinar programs, you can go to TAH.org/programs/webinars.